The sweat was pouring down my face as I watched Sheriff Karen yank the power cord from the wall. 87-year-old Mrs. Henderson collapsed into her wheelchair, gasping in the sudden stifling heat. Children started crying as the cooling system died with a mechanical wheeze. Karen turned to me with that cold smile and said the words that changed everything. "Your little charity operation is done, permanently." 3 minutes later, I was on my phone making the call that would destroy her career forever. The thermometer outside my HVAC shop read 108 degrees that Tuesday morning in July. Our small town of Cedar Falls had been baking under the worst heat wave in 20 years. The local news kept warning about heat-related deaths, especially among the elderly and families who could not afford to run their air conditioning all day. That is when I knew we had to do something. My name is Marcus Chen, and I have been running Chen Climate Solutions for 15 years. I know every air conditioning unit in this town, and I know which families are struggling to keep cool. The electric bills were crushing people, forcing them to choose between staying cool and paying rent. I called my friend David Martinez, who sits on the city council. We talked about opening a cooling center in the old community hall on Maple Street. The building had been sitting empty for months, but it had good bones and plenty of space. Within 2 days, I had donated a commercial-grade cooling system, and local businesses pitched in for the electricity costs. The response was overwhelming. Elderly residents arrived with their folding chairs and medications. Young mothers brought their bobbies and toddlers, grateful for somewhere safe to escape the heat. Construction workers stopped by during their lunch breaks. The cooling center became more than just relief from the temperature. It became a community gathering place where neighbors helped neighbors. Mrs. Henderson was our most regular visitor. At 87, she lived alone in a house with no central air, just a window unit that barely worked. She would arrive every morning at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying her knitting bag and a thermos of sweet tea. She became like a grandmother to all the children who came with their parents. "This place is a blessing," she told me one afternoon as she watched kids playing quietly in the cool air. "You have saved lives, Marcus. Do not let anyone tell you different." I should have known that success would bring problems. Sheriff Karen Mitchell had been watching our cooling center from day one. I caught her driving by slowly, her patrol car windows down, staring at the families going in and out. She never stopped to check on anyone or offer help. She just watched with those cold, calculating eyes. The first sign of trouble came when Deputy Roberts stopped by. He was young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable as he looked around at the elderly folks and families. "Sheriff wants to know about your permits," he said quietly. "She is asking questions about insurance and liability." I showed him our folder of documentation: business license, insurance certificates, fire department approval, health department clearance. Everything was in order, properly filed and approved. Deputy Roberts nodded and left, but I could see the worry in his face. That night, I could not shake the feeling that Sheriff Karen was looking for reasons to shut us down. I had heard the stories about her from other business owners. How she used her badge to intimidate anyone who did not fall in line with her vision of how things should be run. But I never imagined she would target a community cooling center that was literally saving lives. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived early as always. She settled into her favorite chair near the main cooling vent and smiled at the children already playing nearby. The temperature outside was climbing toward 110 degrees. Inside our cooling center, it was a comfortable 72 degrees. None of us knew that in less than an hour, Sheriff Karen would walk through that door and change everything. Sheriff Karen Mitchell burst through the cooling center doors at exactly 11:15 that morning. She was flanked by two deputies, both looking uncomfortable but following orders. Her heavy boots echoed across the tile floor as families looked up in surprise and concern. "Everyone out," she announced, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of the air conditioning. "This facility is being shut down immediately for safety violations." I stood up from where I had been helping Mrs. Henderson adjust her chair. My heart was already racing, but I kept my voice calm and respectful. "Sheriff, what safety violations? We have all our permits and inspections current." She turned those cold blue eyes on me with a look of pure contempt. "Do not question me, Chen. I have reports of electrical hazards, overcrowding, and unlicensed operation of commercial cooling equipment." The lies came so easily from her mouth. I pulled out our permit folder and approached her carefully. Behind me, I could hear children starting to whimper as their parents gathered them closer. Mrs. Henderson was gripping the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white with fear. "Here are our permits," I said, offering the folder. "Fire department, health department, business license, insurance certificates. Everything is in order and up to date." Sheriff Karen snatched the folder from my hands and barely glanced at the contents before tossing it onto a nearby table. Papers scattered across the floor. "These are meaningless," she said with a dismissive wave. "I have authority to shut down any operation that poses a public safety risk." "What public safety risk?" I asked, my voice getting stronger despite my racing heart. "We are providing life-saving cooling during a dangerous heat wave." Her face flushed red with anger. "Are you challenging my authority? Are you questioning a law enforcement decision?" The room had gone completely silent except for the air conditioning system running at full capacity. Everyone was watching this confrontation, afraid to move or speak. Mrs. Henderson was breathing heavily, clearly distressed by the confrontation. "I am just asking for clarification," I said. "These people need this cooling center. The temperature outside is over 100 degrees. "Then they can go somewhere else," Sheriff Karen snapped. "There are other options." "What other options?" I asked. "Where else can they go that is free and accessible?" That question hit something deep in her. Her eyes narrowed to slits, and she stepped closer to me in a clear attempt at intimidation. "That is not my problem," she said coldly. "My job is public safety, and this operation is not safe." Then she did something that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. She walked over to the main electrical panel where our commercial cooling system was connected. Without warning, without giving anyone time to prepare, she grabbed the main power cord and yanked it from the wall socket. The sudden silence was deafening. The gentle hum that had provided comfort and relief died instantly. Within seconds, you could feel the temperature starting to climb. The cool air that had been circulating began to stagnate. Mrs. Henderson gasped and clutched her chest. Two small children started crying. A mother with a baby rushed toward the door, clearly panicked about her infant overheating. "There," Sheriff Karen said with satisfaction. "Problem solved." I stood there in shock, watching families scramble toward the exits. The elderly residents moved as quickly as they could, but several needed assistance. Mrs. Henderson was struggling to breathe in the sudden heat, her face already turning red. "You cannot do this," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You are endangering lives." "I am enforcing the law," she replied coldly. "And if you attempt to restart this operation, you will be arrested for operating without proper permits." She turned to her deputies. Make sure this place stays shut down. Anyone who tries to use this facility gets cited for trespassing. As she walked toward the door, she looked back at me with that cruel smile. Next time, maybe you will think twice before running operations without proper approval from the sheriff's department. The door slammed behind her, leaving us in the rapidly warming building with no cooling, no relief, and no hope. The families who had counted on us were now forced back into the dangerous heat with nowhere else to turn. But Sheriff Karen had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated exactly how far I was willing to go to protect my community. The next few hours were chaos. I watched helplessly as elderly residents struggled in the blazing heat, searching for somewhere cool to go. Mrs. Henderson's daughter had to pick her up and take her to the emergency room because she was having trouble breathing. Two other seniors ended up at the hospital with heat exhaustion before noon. I started making phone calls immediately. First, I called City Council member David Martinez. "This is insane," David said when I explained what happened. "We approved that cooling center through proper channels. Karen has no authority to shut it down." But when David called the city attorney, the news was not good. Sheriff Karen had filed a complaint claiming electrical hazards and insurance liability issues. Even though our permits were valid, the city was now worried about lawsuits if someone got hurt. "We need time to investigate her claims," the city attorney told David. "Until then, the cooling center has to stay closed." I called the fire chief next. Captain Williams had personally inspected our facility and approved it. "Your setup was perfect," he assured me. "Professional installation, proper ventilation, no safety issues whatsoever. But Karen is claiming I missed something in my inspection. She is demanding a full reinspection before you can reopen." The reinspection would take weeks to schedule. In the meantime, people were suffering in the heat with no alternatives. The nearest public cooling center was 30 miles away in the county seat, and most of our elderly residents could not make that drive. I spent the afternoon visiting families who had depended on our center. Mrs. Rodriguez was trying to keep her 3 young children cool with wet towels and a single fan. Her electric bill was already behind, and she could not afford to run the air conditioning all day. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked me with tears in her eyes. "My baby is only 6 months old. This heat is dangerous for him." At the Johnson house, I found 82-year-old Mr. Johnson sitting in his sweltering living room with all the curtains drawn. His window air conditioner had died 2 days ago, and he was trying to survive on just a small fan. "I cannot afford to fix it," he told me. "Social Security does not stretch that far. That cooling center was my lifeline." Each visit broke my heart a little more. These were not just statistics or numbers. These were my neighbors, people I had known for years, now suffering because one person decided to abuse her power. That evening, I did some research on Sheriff Karen Mitchell. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 3 years, she had shut down 5 different community programs, a food bank operating out of the Methodist Church, a free medical clinic run by volunteer nurses, an after-school program for low-income families. Each time she claimed safety violations or permit issues. Each time the programs never reopened. I found a pattern. Every program she targeted was free, community-based, and served the most vulnerable residents. Every program that got shut down was later replaced by a private, for-profit alternative that happened to have connections to her family or close friends. The cooling center shutdown was not about safety. It was about power and control. Sheriff Karen could not tolerate any program that operated outside her authority or threatened her vision of how things should be run. But I also discovered something else in my research. Several business owners and former city employees had tried to stand up to her over the years. Every single one had been harassed, intimidated, or driven out of town. Sheriff Karen had a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed her. As I sat in my living room that night, listening to the air conditioning run while my neighbors suffered in the heat, I made a decision. I was not going to be another person who backed down from her threats. I was not going to let her destroy a program that was saving lives just to feed her ego. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win. I spent the next week digging into Sheriff Karen Mitchell's background like my life depended on it. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. This was not just about power trips or ego. This was about money. My first breakthrough came from talking to Linda Santos, who used to run the community food bank that Sheriff Karen shut down 2 years ago. Linda was hesitant to talk at first, clearly still frightened of retaliation. "She made our lives hell," Linda told me over coffee at a diner outside town. "Surprise inspections every week, claims about expired food that was not expired, threats about health code violations that did not exist. We spent more time dealing with her harassment than actually feeding people." Linda showed me documentation of Sheriff Karen's campaign against the food bank. 17 separate complaints filed with different city departments. Multiple surprise inspections that found nothing wrong. Threatening letters claiming the food bank was operating illegally. "She finally got us when she claimed we were serving food without proper permits," Linda said. "It was completely false, but fighting it would have cost thousands in legal fees. We had to shut down." "What happened after you closed?" I asked. Linda's face darkened. 3 weeks later, Karen's brother-in-law opened a for-profit food distribution center. Same building, same suppliers, but now people had to pay for what used to be free. That was the pattern. I found it repeated with every program Sheriff Karen had targeted. The free medical clinic was replaced by a private practice run by her cousin. The after-school program was replaced by a fee-based childcare center owned by her former deputy's wife. But the cooling center was different. I could not figure out what private business would benefit from shutting us down. Then I discovered the answer in an old newspaper article about the county's heat emergency response plan. The article mentioned that during extreme heat events, the county had a contract with Mitchell Climate Services to provide emergency cooling trailers. The owner of Mitchell Climate Services was Robert Mitchell, Sheriff Karen's ex-husband, who she had divorced, but still worked with on various business deals. I called the county emergency management office and asked about their heat emergency protocols. The clerk was happy to explain their system. When the temperature hits certain thresholds and community cooling centers are not available, we activate emergency cooling trailers, she told me. It costs the county about $15,000 per day, but it is necessary to prevent heat-related deaths. $15,000 per day. That was Sheriff Karen's real motivation. Every day our free cooling center remained closed, the county would be forced to pay her ex-husband's company for emergency cooling services. I started documenting everything. Phone records showing calls between Sheriff Karen and Robert Mitchell on the day she shut down our center. County payment records showing contracts with Mitchell Climate Services activated within hours of our closure. Financial records showing that Sheriff Karen still had business interests connected to her ex-husband's company. My investigation also revealed something else. Sheriff Karen had been pressuring other business owners to oppose community programs. She had threatened to increase patrol presence around businesses that supported the cooling center. She had warned contractors that city permits might be delayed for anyone who worked with community organizations. The intimidation campaign went deeper than I realized. I found 3 businesses that had withdrawn support for community programs after visits from Sheriff Karen. 2 contractors had stopped donating services after she threatened permit delays. Even some city employees were afraid to speak up because she had connections throughout the county government. But I also found allies. Deputy Roberts, the young officer who had checked our permits, was disgusted with Sheriff Karen's tactics. He could not speak publicly without risking his job, but he provided me with information about her pattern of harassment. She has been doing this for years, he told me in confidence. Anyone who does not fall in line gets targeted. She uses her badge like a weapon against anyone who challenges her control. Captain Williams from the fire department was also fed up with her interference. She has no authority over fire safety inspections, he said, but she keeps undermining our approvals to serve her own agenda. Even some city council members were starting to question her tactics, though they were afraid to confront her directly. The city attorney had received multiple complaints about Sheriff Karen's abuse of authority, but no one had been willing to file formal charges. By the end of the week, I had built a comprehensive case file. Financial motivations, abuse of authority, witness statements, documented harassment patterns, and evidence of corruption. But I also knew that evidence alone would not be enough. Sheriff Karen had survived challenges before by intimidating her opponents into silence. This time was going to be different. I was not going to just file complaints and hope for the best. I was going to take direct action that she could not ignore, could not suppress, and could not spin to her advantage. It was time to bring in the climate control trailer. The industrial climate control trailer arrived on a Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I had called in every favor I had in the HVAC industry to get this unit on short notice. It was a massive piece of equipment, designed for cooling large construction sites and emergency situations. The trailer was 30 feet long, mounted on heavy-duty axles, with enough cooling capacity to handle a building twice the size of our community center. I had positioned myself legally for this moment. The trailer was licensed as emergency equipment. I had obtained all necessary permits for temporary placement on public property. The insurance coverage exceeded city requirements. Every document was perfect. Every regulation followed to the letter. Word had spread through the community overnight that something was happening. As the delivery truck rounded the corner onto Maple Street, people started gathering. Mrs. Henderson's daughter had brought her in a wheelchair, determined to be there when we reopened. Families with children stood watching from the sidewalk. Construction workers stopped their vehicles to see what was happening. The trailer positioning took an hour. I directed the delivery crew to place it directly adjacent to the community center, with the cooling ducts positioned to pump conditioned air through the building's windows. Professional installation, proper electrical connections, safety equipment all in place. Sheriff Karen arrived just as we were completing the setup. Her patrol car screeched to a stop, and she jumped out with her face already red with anger. She marched across the street like she was going to war. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she shouted at me in front of the gathered crowd. "Providing emergency cooling services to the community," I replied calmly. "All permits are in order, all regulations followed." She snatched the permit folder from my hands and started flipping through the pages frantically. Her eyes were scanning for any error, any excuse to shut us down again. But there were no errors. I had spent days making sure every detail was perfect. "This is illegal," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence from our first confrontation. "You cannot operate cooling equipment without proper licensing." "The equipment is licensed," I said, handing her the registration paperwork. "The operator is certified. The installation meets all safety codes. Fire department has inspected and approved." Captain Williams stepped forward from the crowd. "Installation looks good to me, Sheriff. Professional work, all safety protocols followed." Sheriff Coren's face was getting redder by the minute. She was surrounded by community members, city officials, and even some of her own deputies who were clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. The media attention she had been trying to avoid was starting to build. "I am ordering you to shut this down immediately," she said, pointing her finger at my chest. "I will not tolerate unauthorized operations in my jurisdiction." "What authorization do you need for emergency cooling equipment during a heat emergency?" I asked. "The county has declared a heat warning. This equipment is providing life-saving services." Mrs. Henderson spoke up from her wheelchair. "Sheriff, people are dying in this heat. My neighbor was hospitalized yesterday. This young man is trying to save lives." "I do not care about your neighbor," Sheriff Coren snapped, then immediately realized how that sounded in front of the crowd. "I mean, public safety is my responsibility, and this operation is not safe." David Martinez from the city council had arrived and was reviewing our permits. "Everything looks in order to me, Sheriff. City has no objections to this emergency cooling operation." Sheriff Coren was trapped. She had no legal grounds to shut down the trailer. Every permit was valid, every regulation followed. The equipment was safer and more professional than our original setup. The community support was overwhelming and very public. But she was not done fighting. She walked over to the trailer's electrical connection and grabbed the power cord, clearly intending to repeat her previous performance. "Do not touch that," I said firmly. "That equipment is privately owned and properly permitted. Interfering with it would be destruction of property." She froze with her hand on the cord. Deputy Roberts was watching her carefully, and I could see the concern in his face. Other community members had started recording the confrontation with their phones. Any illegal action she took now would be documented and witnessed by dozens of people. "This is not over," she said through gritted teeth. "I will find violations. I will shut this down." "I look forward to your professional inspection," I replied. "Until then, we will continue providing emergency cooling services to community members who need them." The cooling system activated with a powerful hum. Within minutes, conditioned air was flowing into the community center. Families started entering the building, grateful for relief from the dangerous heat. Mrs. Henderson was the first person through the door, tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Coren stood there for another few minutes, clearly trying to think of something else to do. But she was surrounded by witnesses, recorded by cameras, and completely out of legal options. Finally, she got back in her patrol car and drove away, but not before giving me a look that promised this war was far from over. The trailer ran perfectly all day. Families who had been suffering for a week finally had somewhere safe and cool to go. Children played happily while parents relaxed in the air conditioning. Elderly residents got the relief they desperately needed. But I knew Sheriff Coren would be back, and next time she would be even more desperate and dangerous. Sheriff Coren's revenge campaign began the next morning. At 6:30 a.m., I was pulled over 3 blocks from my house for suspicious driving behavior. The traffic stop lasted 45 minutes while she searched my vehicle and ran multiple checks on my license and registration. "Brake light looks dim," she said, writing me a citation. "Get it fixed or face additional penalties." My brake lights were perfect. I had checked them the night before, knowing she would be looking for any excuse to harass me. By noon, she had called for a surprise inspection of my HVAC business. She arrived with a building inspector, a fire marshal, and an environmental compliance officer, all looking embarrassed to be part of her harassment campaign. "Anonymous complaint about improper chemical storage," she announced as they went through my shop. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. My business had been operating safely for 15 years with a spotless safety record. The harassment extended to my family. My wife Sarah got pulled over on her way to work for erratic lane changes. My teenage son was questioned about suspicious activity when he was walking home from school. Sheriff Coren was making it clear that challenging her authority would bring consequences for everyone I cared about. But the community was watching. Every traffic stop was witnessed by neighbors. Every harassment incident was recorded and shared on social media. Local news stations started asking questions about Sheriff Coren's unusual focus on one business owner and his family. The cooling center trailer continued operating successfully despite her efforts. Families relied on it every day as the heat wave continued. Mrs. Henderson had recovered from her hospital visit and was back to her daily routine of knitting in the cool air while watching children play. Sheriff Coren's frustration was becoming obvious to everyone. She started making mistakes. Aggressive traffic stops with no violations. Harassment that was clearly personal rather than professional. Other business owners started coming forward with their own stories of intimidation and abuse of power. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. I was locking up my shop when Sheriff Coren pulled up in her patrol car. She got out and approached me with that familiar look of cold rage. "You think you are smart," she said. "You think you have won something, but I am going to destroy you and your little charity operation." "Sheriff, this is harassment," I said calmly. "I am conducting legal business operations with proper permits and community support." "I do not care about your permits," she snarled. "I care about respect for authority. You have made me look bad in front of the whole town." "You made yourself look bad," I replied. "I just provided cooling services during a heat emergency." That was when she made the mistake that would end her career. She stepped closer, her hand moving to her weapon in a clear threat gesture. "Keep running your mouth," she said. "See what happens to people who do not show proper respect." What she did not realize was that my shop security cameras were recording everything. Her explicit threat, her hand on her weapon, her admission that this was about her ego rather than public safety. All of it was captured in high-definition video with clear audio. She also did not realize that Deputy Roberts was sitting in his patrol car across the street, watching the entire confrontation with growing concern. When Sheriff Coren made the threat gesture, he immediately called for backup and prepared to intervene if necessary. "Sheriff, we have a call," Deputy Roberts said over the radio, giving her an excuse to leave before she did something that would result in immediate arrest. She stared at me for another long moment, her hand still near her weapon. Then she turned and walked back to her patrol car without another word. As soon as she drove away, Deputy Roberts approached me. "Are you okay?" he asked. That was completely out of line. "I am fine," I said, "but I think she just crossed a line that she cannot uncross." "You need to file a formal complaint," he said. "What she just did was not just harassment. That was intimidation with a deadly weapon. That is a felony." I went home that night knowing that everything had changed. Sheriff Karen had moved beyond abuse of power into criminal behavior. The security footage showed clear evidence of threats and intimidation that no court could ignore. The war was about to become a legal battle, and I had just gained the evidence I needed to win it. The formal complaint was filed Monday morning. By Tuesday, the state attorney general's office had opened an investigation. By Wednesday, Sheriff Karen Mitchell was suspended pending a full review of her conduct. The security footage of her threatening me had been turned over to prosecutors, along with documented evidence of her harassment campaign and abuse of authority. The community response was overwhelming. Business owners who had been intimidated for years finally felt safe to come forward. Families who had been harassed started sharing their stories. Even some of Sheriff Karen's own deputies provided statements about her pattern of misconduct and abuse of power. The local news coverage was devastating for her. Sheriff under investigation for abuse of power ran as the lead story for 3 straight days. The security footage of her threat was played repeatedly, showing her hand moving toward her weapon as she tried to intimidate me. Mrs. Henderson gave an interview that broke my heart. Sitting in her wheelchair outside the cooling center, she talked about how Sheriff Karen's actions had nearly killed her. "That woman put my life at risk for her own ego," Mrs. Henderson said to the reporter. "Mr. Chen saved my life, and she tried to destroy him for it. That is not what we expect from law enforcement." The state investigation moved quickly. Investigators interviewed dozens of community members, reviewed financial records, and examined Sheriff Karen's pattern of shutting down community programs. They discovered the financial connections between her and the private businesses that benefited from closing free community services. The evidence was overwhelming. Abuse of authority, harassment, intimidation, corruption, and criminal threats. The investigators found violations of civil rights, misuse of public resources, and a pattern of conduct that violated multiple state laws. Sheriff Karen tried to fight back through her lawyer, claiming she was just enforcing public safety regulations. But the evidence contradicted every defense she attempted. Professional inspectors testified that our cooling center was safe and properly operated. City officials confirmed that all our permits were valid and properly obtained. The financial investigation was particularly damaging. Records showed that county payments to her ex-husband's cooling trailer service had increased by over $200,000 in the past year, mostly due to emergency situations created when Sheriff Karen shut down free community cooling centers. The corruption charges were filed first, using her position for personal financial gain, conspiracy to defraud the county government, misuse of public resources. Each charge carried potential prison time and the permanent loss of her law enforcement certification. The criminal threat charges came next. Intimidation with a deadly weapon, harassment under color of authority, civil rights violations. The security footage made these charges impossible to defend against. The civil lawsuits followed immediately. I filed suit for harassment and violation of my civil rights. Mrs. Henderson's family sued for endangerment and discrimination. 3 other business owners filed similar suits for years of harassment and intimidation. The court hearings were packed with community members who had been affected by Sheriff Coren's abuse of power. Former deputies testified about orders they had refused to follow because they were illegal. City officials admitted they had been afraid to challenge her because of her reputation for retaliation. The most powerful testimony came from Linda Santos, the former food bank director. She described years of harassment that had destroyed a program feeding hundreds of families. Her voice shook as she talked about elderly residents who had gone hungry because Sheriff Coren wanted to shut down free community services. She used her badge as a weapon against the most vulnerable people in our community, Linda said. She destroyed programs that were saving lives just to feed her own ego and her family's bank account. Sheriff Coren sat at the defendant's table throughout the hearings, no longer wearing her uniform, no longer carrying the authority she had abused for so long. Her lawyer tried to present character witnesses, but few people were willing to speak on her behalf. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern of abuse too clear. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Guilty on all charges, immediate termination from law enforcement, loss of pension benefits, 5 years in state prison, restitution payments to victims, permanent ban from holding any position of public trust. The defendant used her position of authority to prey upon vulnerable community members, the judge said during sentencing. She perverted the noble purpose of law enforcement into a tool for personal gain and petty revenge. The community's trust has been betrayed in the most fundamental way. As Sheriff Coren was led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the damage she had caused would take years to fully repair. Programs had been destroyed, lives had been endangered, and community trust had been shattered. But the cooling center trailer was still running, still providing relief to families who needed it. And that was what mattered most. 6 months later, I stood in the grand opening ceremony of the new Cedar Falls Community Resource Center. The old community hall had been completely renovated and expanded with permanent commercial-grade climate control, meeting rooms, and space for multiple community programs. The cooling center had evolved into something much bigger and more important. Sheriff Coren Mitchell was serving her sentence at the State Women's Correctional Facility. Her appeals had been denied, her reputation destroyed, her legacy forever tied to corruption and abuse. The financial restitution had forced her to sell her house and surrender most of her assets to compensate her victims. But more importantly, her removal had allowed the community to heal and grow. The new sheriff, Captain Williams from the fire department, had restored trust in law enforcement through transparency and genuine community service. Deputies who had been afraid to speak up under Sheriff Coren's regime were now actively working to rebuild relationships with residents. The cooling center had operated flawlessly throughout the rest of that brutal summer. Hundreds of families had relied on it for relief from dangerous heat. 3 elderly residents told me personally that the cooling center had saved their lives. Mrs. Henderson had fully recovered and was now volunteering to help other seniors who needed assistance. The community programs that Sheriff Coren had destroyed were coming back stronger than ever. Linda Santos had reopened the food bank with expanded services and proper funding. The free medical clinic was operating again with volunteer doctors and nurses. The after-school program was serving twice as many children as before. My own life had been transformed by the experience. Chen Climate Solutions had grown into a regional business with contracts throughout the state. But more importantly, I had learned the power of standing up to corruption and fighting for what is right. The harassment and intimidation had been difficult, but the outcome made every challenge worthwhile. The climate control trailer that had sparked our victory was now permanently stationed at the resource center. During extreme weather events, it provided backup cooling or heating as needed. But it also served as a symbol of what communities could accomplish when people refused to accept injustice. I received a letter from Sheriff Karen about 4 months into her sentence. She claimed she had been trying to protect the community and that I had misunderstood her intentions. She asked for my forgiveness and suggested that we had both made mistakes in our conflict. I threw the letter away without finishing it. There was no ambiguity about her actions. She had deliberately targeted vulnerable community members for personal gain. She had abused her authority to intimidate anyone who challenged her control. She had nearly caused deaths through her petty revenge against a life-saving cooling center. The real victory was not Sheriff Karen's imprisonment. The real victory was the transformation of our community. People who had been afraid to speak up for years were now actively involved in local government. Business owners were working together on community projects without fear of retaliation. Families knew they had resources and support when they needed help. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep the following winter. She was 98 years old and had spent her final months volunteering at the resource center, helping other seniors navigate community services. At her funeral, her daughter thanked me for giving her mother those final months of purpose and community connection. "She always said you were her hero," her daughter told me. "Not just for the cooling center, but for showing her that ordinary people could fight back against bullies and win." The resource center now serves over 500 families regularly. During heat waves, we can accommodate up to 200 people at a time in climate-controlled comfort. During winter storms, we provide emergency heating. Throughout the year, we host community meetings, job training programs, health screenings, and social events. The inscription on the wall reads, "Dedicated to the principle that every community member deserves dignity, safety, and support, regardless of their ability to pay." Every time I read those words, I remember that sweltering Tuesday morning when Sheriff Karen yanked the power cord from the wall. I remember Mrs. Henderson gasping in the sudden heat. I remember the fear in children's eyes as they were forced back into dangerous temperatures. And I remember making the phone call that changed everything. 3 minutes. That is how long it took to go from victim to fighter. That is how long it took to decide that justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The cooling center that Sheriff Karen tried to destroy became the foundation for something she never could have imagined. A community united by the shared experience of standing up to corruption. A place where neighbors help neighbors without fear of retaliation. A symbol that even the most powerful bullies can be defeated when ordinary people refuse to back down. Every summer when the temperature climbs above 100 degrees, I walk through the resource center and see families staying cool and safe. Children playing in air-conditioned comfort. Elderly residents socializing without fear of heat stroke. All of it made possible because we refused to let one person's abuse of power destroy something that saved lives. Sheriff Karen Mitchell thought she could intimidate us into submission. She thought her badge made her untouchable. She thought wrong. The truth is simple. Communities are stronger than corruption. Justice is more powerful than intimidation. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to make that 3-minute phone call that changes everything.